The rain had not yet come when Ruth Calloway walked past her unplowed field for the third morning in a row, and the men on the fence line laughed loud enough that her dog lifted his head from the porch and let out a low, uncertain growl. "Mercy, isn't it?" the flooded sky says. "Let's watch a widow decide not to plant a field she has planted every spring for 11 years, and let's see what the neighbors make of it." If you have ever known someone who trusted their own eyes over the whole town's opinion, someone who kept quiet and let the proof speak for itself, you already understand the kind of woman Ruth Calloway was. Stay with this one to the end, because before it is done, you will see exactly why she let that field sit bare while the rest of the valley planted right up to the riverbank. And you will see what the river did to prove her right. If a story like this one means something to you, tap that like button now and subscribe so you do not miss what happens when the water comes. Ruth was 31 years old that spring, a widow going on 2 years, and she worked the Calloway homestead alone except for a dog named Bramble, a big, rough-coated golden retriever who had been her husband Thomas's dog before he passed, and had become, in the quiet accounting of a lonely house, something closer to a partner than a pet. The house sat on 80 acres in a bend of the Cotter River in the Kansas Territory, a modest clapboard place with a leaning porch and a barn that wanted new shingles Ruth could not yet afford. She had inherited the land from Thomas, who had inherited it from his father, Amos Calloway, a man who had walked that valley since before the war and had known the river the way some men know Scripture, by heart and without needing to look. Amos had died the winter before Thomas married Ruth, so she had never met him, but she had come to know him anyway through the notebook. It was a plain thing, bound in oilcloth gone soft and dark with handling, and it had sat for years on a shelf in the barn office where Thomas kept his ledgers. Ruth found it 3 months after burying her husband, when grief had quieted enough that she could finally go through his things without her hands shaking. Inside, in a cramped, patient hand, Amos Calloway had recorded 40 years of weather, not just rain and shine, but the color of the sky at dusk, the behavior of the cattle before a storm, the height of the river measured against a stone he had marked on the bank, the smell of the air on mornings that turned bad by nightfall. He had written about 3 floods in his lifetime, each one worse than the valley expected, each one preceded by signs that the other farmers had shrugged off as nothing more than an unusually wet spring. The last entry about flooding, dated some 15 years back, read simply, "River took the Hollis field again this year. Told him in March." He did not listen because the ground looked fine to him. Ground always looks fine right up until it doesn't. Ruth had read that line more times than she could count, so when the spring came wet, wetter than any spring she could remember, and the river ran high and brown and fast even in April, she walked the low field down by the bend, the field that had always given her family's best corn, and she measured the water against Amos's stone, and she did not plant it. The town noticed before she had finished not planting it. Wade Pruitt saw her from the road first, standing at the fence with his brother Otis, and called across the ditch that she had gotten her calendar wrong, that spring came every year, same as it always had. Ruth did not answer him. She kept walking the fence line with Bramble trotting at her heel, and she let the silence do what silence does, which is make some men uncomfortable and other men louder. By the end of that week, half the valley seemed to have an opinion about the widow Calloway's empty field. Otis Pruitt told anyone who would listen that a woman alone could not be expected to know good ground from bad, and that it was a shame nobody had stepped in to guide her. Vernon Aldrich, who owned the mill and fancied himself the valley's unofficial mayor, made a point of riding past the Calloway place twice in one afternoon just to look at the bare dirt and shake his head where she could see him doing it. It was Vernon who finally stopped and spoke to her directly, one hand resting on his saddle horn, the other gesturing at the empty field like a man presenting evidence in a trial. "That's good bottom land going to waste, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Best corn ground on this stretch of river. Folks are asking why you'd leave it fallow in a season like this."
"The water's high," Ruth said. "Higher than it ought to be this early."
"Water's always high in April. It comes down by June, same as it does every year."
"Not always,"
she said, and left it there, because she had learned that arguing with a man like Vernon Aldrich only fed him more to argue with. He rode off unsatisfied, and word spread the way it does in a small valley, mouth to mouth, porch to porch, until by Sunday the whole congregation at the little clapboard church seemed to know that the widow Calloway had let good land sit idle out of some notion nobody could quite explain. Ruth sat in her pew with her hands folded and her chin level, and she felt the glances the way a person feels a draft, not sharp, just constant and cold. After the service, Constance Pruitt, Wade's wife, caught her on the church steps with a look that was trying hard to be kind and mostly succeeding.
"I don't mean any harm by it, Ruth," Constance said, "but a woman on her own has got to be careful not to make herself a curiosity. People talk enough as it is." "Let 'em talk," Ruth said. "The field will still be there in June, whether they're talking about it or not."
Constance's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite disapproval, and she went on her way, and Ruth walked home along the river road with Bramble ranging ahead of her through the wet grass, and she thought, not for the first time, that being disbelieved was a smaller wound than people made it out to be, so long as you had already decided what you believed. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the oilcloth notebook open under the lamp and read Amos's words again, the ones about the smell of the air, about cattle bunching up along the high ground for no reason a man could see, about a particular slate color the sky took on 2 days before real trouble arrived. She had seen that slate color twice already that month. She had watched her own 2 milk cows drift, without her herding them, up toward the rise behind the barn and stay there 3 mornings running. She did not know everything Amos Calloway had known, not by a long measure, but she had his eyes to borrow, and that felt, some nights, like enough. Rather than the low field, she planted her potatoes and her beans up on the rise, ground she had never used for a full crop before, because it was rockier and took more work to break, and she put her small herd of 10 head of cattle up there too, moving the fence posts herself over 3 long days, with Bramble supervising from whatever patch of shade he could find. Her hands blistered, her back ached in a way that made her understand, freshly, why farming was usually a 2-person enterprise. She kept at it anyway, because the alternative, in her accounting, was worse. Word of that move got around too, and if anything, it made the talk sharper, because now she was not merely leaving good land empty, she was spending good labor breaking bad land instead. And to the men leaning on the fence rail outside the general store, that looked less like caution and more like plain foolishness compounding itself. "She's going to starve, that dog, and herself both," Otis Pruitt said one afternoon, loud enough to carry. "Working rocky ground when she's got the best bottom acreage on the river, sitting there doing nothing." Bramble, walking beside Ruth's wagon at the time, gave a single sharp bark in Otis's direction, as if he had understood the insult and wanted the record to show his objection. Ruth put a hand down without looking, and the dog quieted, and she kept the wagon moving. She was not made of stone, whatever the fence rail men believed. She went home some nights and cried where no one could see her, not for the field, not for the talk, but for Thomas, and for the particular loneliness of being a young widow trying to hold a farm together with only a dead man's father's handwriting for counsel. Bramble would come and lay his head across her feet on those nights, heavy and warm and entirely unbothered by rumor, and she would put her hand in his fur and remember that Thomas had loved this dog before he loved her, and that loving him now was one of the last threads she had left connecting her to the life she had planned before the fever took her husband in a single terrible week 2 winters back. There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself, that simply sits at the table with you every evening like an uninvited guest who has learned your habits well enough to know exactly when to speak. Ruth had grown almost used to its company. What she had not grown used to, and did not expect to, was doing all of this, the grief and the farm and the doubt of an entire valley, entirely alone. Except she was not entirely alone, not in the way the fence rail men imagined. There was Bramble, obviously, who slept across her doorway most nights as though he had appointed himself her sentry. And there was, unexpectedly, Dr. Everett Hale. Everett had come to the valley 2 years back, a physician with a limp from an old injury and a manner that struck most people as too quiet for a doctor, as though he ought to have more bluster to inspire confidence. Ruth had first spoken to him properly the week Thomas died, when he had ridden out through a hard rain to sit with a dying man he had never met, and had stayed afterward not because there was any more medicine to give, but because he had judged, correctly, that Ruth should not spend that first night entirely by herself. He had checked on her every few weeks since, under the thin pretense of a doctor's ordinary rounds, and Ruth had come to expect his visits with a feeling she did not examine too closely. He was not a large man, not the broad-shouldered cattleman type the valley's other bachelors tended toward, but there was a steadiness in him, a way of listening that made a person feel heard rather than simply waited on, and Ruth found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she looked forward to the sound of his horse on the road. He came by on a gray afternoon in early May, not long after the potato planting, and found her mending fence up on the rise, with Bramble stretched out in the grass nearby, keeping half an eye on the work and half an eye on a rabbit trail through the weeds. "You've made yourself unpopular," Everett said, dismounting, "planting the high ground instead of the bottom." "I've made myself unpopular before," Ruth said. "It doesn't kill you." "No," he agreed, "but it does make a person lonely." She looked at him a moment, surprised at the directness of it, and something in her chest loosened slightly, the way it did on the rare occasions someone spoke to her plainly instead of around her. "I read something my father-in-law wrote," she said, "about floods, about the river." "You think it's coming?" "I think the water's higher in May than it should be. I think the cattle know something the men in town don't want to know. I think I'd rather be laughed at now than be right too late to matter." Everett looked out over the low field, empty and green with new grass instead of corn, and then at the swollen brown ribbon of the river beyond it, and he did not laugh, and he did not argue. "My father was a riverman back in Ohio," he said the same kind of thing you're saying. Nobody believed him either until the year they did." "What happened that year?" "We moved," he said with a small, dry twist of a smile, "after the water took the house." It was not much of a conversation, not by the measure of grand romantic scenes, but it settled something in Ruth that had been unsettled for weeks. Here was a man who did not need her to be right in order to respect the reasoning behind her caution, who understood that a woman could look at a river and see something true even if nobody else in the valley cared to look. He did not stay long that afternoon. He rarely did. But before he rode off, he paused at the fence and said without any particular weight to it that he would come by again soon. And Ruth found herself hoping, in a small, private way she was not ready to name, that he meant it. May wore on, wet and uneasy. The river did not flood, not yet, and the fence rail talk in town shifted from mockery to something closer to smugness, as though the absence of disaster so far were proof that disaster had never truly been coming. Wade Pruitt planted his own low field right up to the water's edge and told anyone who asked that he expected a fine crop of corn by August, better than usual on account of all the rain filling out the kernels. Vernon Aldridge made another slow pass by the Calloway place, this time not stopping, just looking. And Ruth understood the look well enough. It said, "Foolish woman," and it said it without a word needing to be spoken. She kept her own counsel. She worked the rise, thinning and weeding potatoes that were coming in stronger than she had dared hope, and she watched the river the way Amos Calloway had watched it, morning and evening, marking the stone on the bank with a scratch of chalk each day so she could see, without guessing, whether the water climbed or fell. It climbed. Slowly, through the last weeks of May, it climbed, an inch some days, nothing at all on others, but never falling back, never giving the valley the relief a normal spring would have offered by then. Ruth wrote her own observations in a second notebook she had begun keeping alongside Amos's old one, not because she thought anyone would ever read hers the way she read his, but because it steadied her to put the pattern down in her own hand, to feel herself joining a line of watching that had started before she was born. Bramble, meanwhile, had taken to a strange new habit. Some mornings, without any command from Ruth, he would trot down to the low field, stand at its edge, and simply bark. 3 sharp barks, and no more, at the water beyond it. He had never done anything of the kind before. Ruth mentioned it to Everett on one of his visits, half joking, and he did not joke back. "Dogs know things," he said, "especially the good ones, especially the ones that have been paying attention to a place for years." "You think he's telling me something?" "I think you already believe he is. I think that's why you're asking." By the second week of June, the rain that had been merely persistent turned relentless. It fell 3 days running, a steady gray downpour that turned the road to the Calloway place into a churn of mud and swelled the Cotter River past any mark Ruth had scratched onto Amos's stone in 11 springs of watching it. On the third night, she woke to Bramble's frantic barking at the front door. Not his usual measured warning bark, but something higher, more urgent, a sound she had never heard from him before. And when she went to the window, she saw, even in the dark and the driving rain, that the river had left its banks. Here is your rhetorical question for the evening, and it is not a small one. What do you do alone on a farm at midnight when the water your neighbors laughed at you for fearing finally arrives exactly the way you always said it would? Ruth did not stand at the window and marvel at being right. There was no room in that moment for satisfaction, only for work. She pulled on her boots and her coat over her nightdress and went out into the rain with a lantern that guttered and struggled against the wet. And Bramble went with her, staying close at her heel the way he had not done since Thomas's illness. As though he understood this was a night that called for a different kind of loyalty than the ordinary kind. The low field was already gone, a sheet of brown water where the fence line had been, and the water was climbing the slope toward the barn, faster than Ruth had believed possible, even having spent weeks preparing for exactly this. Her cattle, thank Providence, and thank Amos Calloway's stubborn insistence on high ground, were safe up on the rise. But the barn itself sat low enough that she could see, by lantern light, water already lapping at its foundation. She spent that night moving what she could: tools, seed sacks, the harness leather that would rot if it soaked, all of it hauled by wheelbarrow and by her own 2 arms, up the slope to the house, which sat, thankfully, on ground high enough to stay dry, even as the valley below it filled. Bramble worked alongside her in his own way, never leaving her side, barking sharply whenever the water's edge crept close enough to threaten her footing, as though standing guard over the boundary between safe ground and dangerous. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, exhausted and soaked through and shaking with cold, Ruth heard a horse coming hard up the road, and she saw, by lantern light, Everett Hale riding toward the house at a pace that told her he had heard about the flood and had not waited for morning to come see about her. "I saw the water from the ridge road," he said, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. "I came straight here." "The barn's flooding," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not break, even though everything in her wanted it to. "I've gotten what I could out." "Then we'll get the rest," he said, and that was all. No speech about her foolishness or her stubbornness or anything else the valley might have said. He simply set to work beside her, and for the rest of that long, terrible night, the 2 of them moved through the flooding dark together, saving what could be saved, while Bramble ran the perimeter between them like a dog determined to hold the whole disaster together through sheer force of loyalty. By dawn, the rain had thinned to a drizzle, and the water, though it had not receded, had at least stopped climbing. Ruth stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket Everett had draped over her shoulders without being asked, and looked down at what had been her low field, and was now a wide brown lake, stretching all the way to where the fence posts, submerged to their tops, marked a boundary that no longer meant anything. "You were right,"
Everett said quietly, standing beside her. I don't feel right, Ruth said. I feel tired. Being right and feeling good about it aren't always the same thing, he said. And she thought that was about the truest sentence anyone had spoken to her in 2 years. The flood, as it turned out, was the worst the valley had seen in Amos Calloway's own long memory. Worse even than the flood that had taken the Hollis field 15 years before. Wade Pruitt's low field, planted right to the water's edge on his confidence that spring would behave the way spring always had, went under entirely. His young corn drowned and ruined along with 2 months of his labor. Otis Pruitt lost a stretch of fence and a good part of his hay crop.
Vernon Aldrich's mill, sitting closer to the river than any prudent man would have built it, took on enough water to ruin a season's worth of stored grain and damage the mill wheel itself so badly it would take the better part of a month to repair. Ruth Calloway's low field was a lake too, same as everyone else's, but her potatoes sat safe and dry on the rise, and her cattle grazed the high pasture untouched, and her barn, though its foundation had taken water, still stood with its contents mostly intact because she had spent one long muddy night hauling what mattered up to safety. Word travels fast in a small valley, faster after a disaster than before one, and by the end of that week, it was not the mockery of the widow Calloway's empty field that passed from porch to porch, but something else entirely, something closer to wonder, and closer still, in some mouths, to shame. It was Constance Pruitt who came first, 3 days after the water began to recede, standing at Ruth's door with her hands twisted together in front of her, the way a person's hands move when their mouth is not yet sure what to say. "Wade's corn is gone," she said. "All of it, and I keep thinking about what you told me on the church steps, about the field still being there in June, whether we were talking about it or not." "I'm sorry for your loss, Constance. I mean that." "I know you do. That's the trouble of it. You could have said something plainer to me that day, could have told me outright you thought the water was coming, and instead you just let us talk ourselves right into losing everything." Constance's voice caught, not with anger exactly, but with something adjacent to it, the particular frustration of a person realizing too late that quiet truth had been offered and refused. "How did you know?" Ruth thought of Amos Calloway's notebook, of 40 years of a dead man's patient handwriting, of a stone on a riverbank marked with chalk, of a dog who had barked at water for no reason anyone else could see. "I didn't know," she said, "not for certain. I watched is all. My husband's father left behind a lifetime of watching, and I decided it was worth more than a calendar telling me spring comes the same every year." Constance stood a long moment in the doorway, looking past Ruth into the small, warm kitchen, at the second notebook open on the table beside the first, at the tidy, careful record of a woman who had chosen, in the face of an entire valley's certainty, to trust her own observation instead. "Would you show it to me?" she asked. "Whatever it is you were watching for, I'd like to know it too, for next time." That was the first visit, but it was not the last. Over the following weeks, one by one, the men who had leaned on the fence rail outside the general store found their way, with varying degrees of embarrassment, to the Calloway porch. Wade Pruitt came without his brother, hat in his hands, and admitted, in a voice that cost him something to use, that he had been wrong to laugh, and would be obliged if she would tell him what signs to watch for come next spring. Otis Pruitt took longer, pride being a harder crop to harvest than corn, but he came too, eventually, standing awkwardly at a distance while Ruth walked him through the notebook's pages, showing him the mark on the stone, the pattern of the cattle drifting to high ground, the particular slate color the sky had worn 2 mornings before the water rose. Even Vernon Aldrich came, though he dressed his humility up in businesslike language, speaking of the valley's need for better flood knowledge and the wisdom of consulting those who had it, as though he had not spent 2 months riding past her empty field, shaking his head. Ruth let him have his dignity. She had learned, watching Amos Calloway's careful, unresentful handwriting, that there was more use in sharing what you knew than in savoring having been right about it. By late summer, the Calloway place had become, without Ruth ever intending it, something like the valley's unofficial school for reading a river. Farmers who had never given a second thought to the color of dusk sky or the behavior of cattle before a storm began stopping by to ask questions, to compare notes, to borrow, however briefly, a dead man's 40 years of patient attention. Ruth found herself, some evenings, sitting at her kitchen table with 3 or 4 neighbors crowded around the old oilcloth notebook, walking them through pages that had once belonged only to her and to Amos, and to a golden dog who seemed to understand, in his own wordless way, exactly what all the fuss was about. Everett Hale kept coming too, more often now than his doctor's rounds strictly required, and neither of them made any particular show of naming what was growing between them, only that his horse became a familiar sight on the road, and that Ruth had begun, without quite noticing when it started, to save him a place at her table without being asked. He was not Thomas, he never would be, and she did not want him to be. But he was steady, and he listened the way a person listens who intends to remember what he hears. And on the evening he finally took her hand across that same kitchen table and asked plainly, without any of the fence-rail bluster the valley's other men favored, whether she would consider a future alongside him. Ruth found that grief and hope could, in fact, sit at the same table together, so long as a person was patient enough to let them. The low field dried out by autumn, silted and changed, richer in some ways than it had been before, the way flooded ground sometimes is once the water finally lets it go. Ruth walked its edge one October morning, with bramble ranging ahead of her through the tall gold grass, and she thought of the men who had laughed at her from that same fence line 6 months before, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she felt no bitterness toward them at all. They had been wrong, and the wrongness had cost them, but they had also come to her door afterward, with their hats in their hands, willing to learn, and there was more decency in that than most people managed after being humbled. She stopped at the fence post, the same one Wade Pruitt had leaned against, calling out that she had gotten her calendar wrong, and she rested her hand on its weathered wood, and she thought of Amos Calloway, a man she had never met, whose 40 years of careful watching had reached across a death and a marriage and a flood to save her farm and, in its own quiet way, to save half the valley's understanding of the river that ran through all their lives. Isn't it something how the quietest kind of knowledge, the kind nobody claps for, the kind that just sits patient in a notebook on a shelf, can end up being the very thing that saves a person when the loud, confident kind fails. That is the whole of what this story has to offer you, and if it landed somewhere true, I would be glad if you left a comment telling me about a time you trusted your own quiet observation over everybody else's loud certainty. Subscribe if you want more stories like Ruth's, and share this one with somebody who needs to hear that being laughed at is not the same as being wrong. Ruth Calloway did not become famous for what she had done, not beyond the valley's own gossiping mouths, and she would not have wanted to be. She simply kept watching, kept writing, kept marking the stone on the riverbank each season the way Amos had taught her without ever meeting her, kept a good dog at her side, and, eventually, a good man, too, and she kept the notebook where anyone in the valley could come and read it, because she had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the true worth of quiet knowledge is not in being proven right. It is in being useful, afterward, to the very people who once refused to believe you. And every spring after that, when the rains came heavy and the river ran high and brown, more than one farmer in that valley found himself walking down to the water's edge before he planted, checking the color of the sky, watching where his cattle chose to stand, and thinking, whether he said it aloud or not, of a widow who had once let a field sit empty while the whole valley laughed, and who had turned out, in the end, to be the only one who had truly been listening to what the river was trying to tell them all along.